For me, I've been here a year now, which is so cool. I got to be part of this family for a year now. It is so much fun. It's so much fun. Something, I hope, we're getting to know each other a little bit better. One thing you maybe don't know about me is actually I used to be a gymnast. Like for real, I used to be a gymnast all the way back in first and second grade. I was in gymnastics as a first and second grade, but I was really good. I can brag a little bit. I was really good. I could do front flips and back flips, the front handsprings. I could do the splits like every direction. I could do the uneven bars. It got to the point where my coach at the time thought I was good enough to actually compete. And so he signed me up for my first meet, and I got to the meet, and I don't know what that means. I'm like, meat, I like bacon, cool. I had no idea what that meant. So I show up to this meet, and as like a little kid, I thought there were so many people. I mean, I walked into the gymnasium, and it was just packed. That's like what my little kid brain looked at, and I froze. I was like, I can't perform in front of all of these people. I was so shy that I spent the entire meet sitting in my mom's lap just crying. I was a mess. I couldn't compete. I couldn't do it. In fact, it was just a few weeks after that I quit gymnastics because I was like, I can't do this. I won't be part of this. Like that moment was like a defining moment in my life where I knew that I was a shy kid, and that's who I was going to be. That I was too shy to be in front of people. I was too shy to perform. I defined myself as the shy kid. Now, obviously, a lot has changed since then. But for years of my life, I always saw myself as the shy kid. And I share that story because, no matter how young or old you are, we all have these moments, these seasons in our lives where something happens and it's like a part of us just gets stuck there. And it's like we can't grow past it, right? I mean, I'm sure you can remember those moments for you. You can probably think of it off the top of your head, right? The moments where, like at school, and you're embarrassed by a teacher, and now you're afraid to speak up. You're afraid to raise your hand and volunteer for something because you might be embarrassed, right? Or maybe you had your heart broken by an ex, and now you're having a hard time believing that you can trust somebody. Right? We have these moments where something happens in our life and we get stuck there and we have this feeling or this belief that, at least for that part of my life, the best of that is behind me. And all that's ahead is to just try to make it through. And you know this, and I got to tell you that nothing could be further from the truth. That the entire story of God throughout the scriptures is a story of redemption. It's a story of new life. It's a story of bringing new and good out of tragedy, out of awful circumstances, right? It's the story that God continually says that the best is yet to come. Trust me, walk with me, lean in here. And that's what this whole series is kind of about. We're in the middle of going through the book of Ruth. We're studying the book of Ruth, and we're going through this book for a number of reasons. One of these reasons, and Pastor Brennan has been saying this every week through this series so far, is, hey, if you have your Bibles, take them out, right? We want to help you actually learn to engage and understand the Bible. And so if you have a Bible, you can take that out. If you got the Bible app, you can use that as well. We want to help you engage in the Bible. And here, as you read this thing, how do you hear what the Lord is saying? How do you know what he's saying to you and speaking to you? And how do we engage this thing together? And so we want to do that together. But also, we're going through the book of Ruth because it is this incredible story where we see, especially relationally, that when we walk with God, man, the best is always yet to come. That he's always got something greater in store for us, people to rally around us and people that we can rally around, that God always shows up and he provides what we need when it comes to loving one another. So today we've been walking through the first chapter of the book of Ruth. Today we're actually going to finish the first chapter of the book of Ruth, okay? And as we do this, though, what I want to do is I want to jump back to the beginning of this chapter, and we're going to just kind of recap some things and bring some new light into some stuff, and that's going to help us understand what this last part of Ruth is all about. So let's jump all the way back to the very first verse in the book of Ruth. It starts like this. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and his 2 sons. Now, this is the opening line of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, it begins with tragedy. That's how the whole story begins, that there is a famine happening, a severe famine happening in the land. Now, famines happen. Like, that's just what we read about in history. But this is particularly startling because it's not just any old famine. This is a famine happening in God's promised land. This is the place God's called his people to be. This is the place where God's people are supposed to be thriving and flourishing. And what we learn is there's a famine. People are starving. It leads me to the first question I want to ask us today. And as we go through this morning, I want to ask you 4 different questions. The first question that this leads me to ask is, what tragedies have happened to you? Right, what tragedies have happened to you? I mean, we start this book of Ruth, and it opens up with tragedy. And again, no matter how young or old we are, tragedies happen. And sometimes tragedies are really truly what happened to you. Right? Maybe that's what comes to mind. It's something that actually happened. It happened to you, right? Maybe as a kid, or even as a coworker, you were bullied. You were betrayed by a close friend. Right? You had an alcoholic father who was abusive. Right? A tragedy that truly happened to you. But sometimes tragedies are also self-inflicted. Right? There's some tragedies that we walk into ourselves. Right? We're a gossip, and we got caught. Right? We compromised our character to fit in, and now we're finding ourselves doing things that we never intended to be doing. Right? We got caught up in a bit of a gambling addiction, and now our finances are struggling, and our relationships are struggling. Right? They're tragedies, but they're self-inflicted. They're things that we kind of walked into and chose ourselves. What tragedies have happened to you? How would you answer that question for yourself? See, the opening verse in Ruth, it begins with a tragedy. So we learn that this family of 4, they pack up and they move to the country of Moab. Now, what's important to know about Moab throughout the Bible is, the way I like to think about it is, Moab throughout the Bible is like the evil opposite of God's people. That's who Moab is throughout the Bible. That Moab, they're a people who have a different religion. They follow a different God. They live in ways that are contrary and counter to how God designed people to live. In fact, if you look at that word Moab in the Hebrew, in the original language, it can be translated a couple different ways, but it's actually an idiom that Moab means people of incest. That's who Moab is. And what happens is that this family of 4, when tragedy strikes in the promised land, right, the famine comes, they choose to leave God's protection, God's provision, God's promised land, and they go to a place that they never should have gone. They leave to Moab. If I can put it maybe a little bit differently, they respond to tragedy by walking into more tragedy. So who is this family of 4? Who are these people? Well, in verse 2, we learn who they are, right? The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi, and their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Now, back in this day, a name wasn't just a name. Right? Back, especially in the Old Testament, a name was like your identity. A name was a declaration of who you were destined to be, who you were designed to be. A name is packed with meaning. So, if you look at the name Elimelech, the name Elimelech means God is king. That Elimelech, from the moment he was born, he was supposed to be someone who lived as a reflection of someone who God is his king. That's who Elimelech is meant to be. That Elimelech is supposed to be the leader of his family and pointing people in the direction of this is what life looks like when God is your king. But that's who Elimelech was destined to be. That's what Elimelech means. Then we have Naomi. I love this. Naomi means sweet or sweetheart. Isn't that beautiful? That's what Naomi means. That Naomi was designed to be Elimelech's sweetheart. She's this sweet wife and this sweet mom that when people encounter Naomi, they have an encounter with this sweet, sweet woman. That's who Naomi is. And then you've got Mahlon and Chilion, and this is, I don't understand. Mahlon and Chilion, Mahlon means death and Chilion means dying. What? We shouldn't have to say this, but hey, if you future parents, if you're planning to have kids, don't name them death and dying. That's messed up. That's weird. It's a weird thing, but names are packed with meaning. And what we learn over the next couple of verses, right, is that death and dying, they both get spouses from Moab. And over these next verses, we kind of get a fast forward of the next 10 years of their life. Over the next 10 years, as they walk from tragedy into tragedy, as they respond to tragedy by walking into more tragedy, the great irony of their name begins for each of them. Over the next 10 years, Elimelech doesn't keep God as his king. In fact, he leaves the promised land. He leaves God's provision, where God is ruling and reigning, and he goes to a place that is far from God. Goes to a people who are far from God. That he begins to live without God as his king. And what we learn about Elimelech is that he dies in Moab without God as his king. We learn that Mahlon and Chilion, and death and dying, do in fact over the next 10 years end up dying. And as we get to the end of chapter 1 in Ruth, we learn the great tragedy of Naomi. So if we can jump ahead here to the end, I want to read you what happens to Naomi. Now, if you remember from last week, what happens in the story, and we'll get back to this in a minute, is after Naomi's family has died, she's left with her 2 daughters-in-law. She sends them off, but Ruth and Naomi are going to go back to the promised land. Okay, so that's where we're going to pick up the story. We're going to jump back and highlight that in a second, but we're at the story where they're going to be going back to the promised land. It says, so picking up in verse 19, it says, so Naomi and Ruth continued on their journey. And when they came to Bethlehem, the place where Naomi's from, the entire town was excited by their arrival. Is it really Naomi? The women asked, right? They recognized her. She's back after 10 years. Is that really her? But here's what Naomi says. She says, don't call me Naomi. Instead, call me Mara. For the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer, and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? Whew. Naomi, the sweet woman, goes from being sweet to changing her name to Mara, which means bitter. That Naomi, she goes from sweetly trusting God to bitterly blaming God for the tragedies of her life. When tragedy came her way, instead of leaning into God, she makes choices that lead her into more tragedy, that lead her into a life of bitterness. And that leads me to my second question. How have you responded to tragedy? Like for you, like when you think about the course of your life or the last season maybe of your life, how have you tended to respond to tragedy? You see, for me, I really wish I could stand up here and be like, yeah, when tragedy strikes my life, I trust God, I lean into it, he's got it. I know that it's not easy, but man, he's got it. I wish that was my story. But just honestly, for me, most of my life, when tragedy has hit me, my life looks a lot more like Naomi. That for me, my go-to is to get mad at God, to get angry when tragedy hits. To just get bitter at God and blame him for things. For me, that tends to be the pattern. Now, I've grown in that, and I'm learning to trust God in tragedy, but for most of my life, I looked a lot more like Naomi. That's how I've responded. How about you? How do you tend to respond to tragedy? You see, for Naomi, she is sweet. That's who she is. But she defines herself by her bitterness. She loses sight of who God created her, designed her, destined her to be. She loses sight that she is a sweet woman, and she gets lost in her bitterness. You see, when tragedy strikes, we do have a choice on how we're going to respond. To trust and lean in and say, Lord, I don't get it. I'm mad, but I'm here with you. Or to blame God and push him away. To walk from tragedy perhaps into more tragedy. We have a choice, and we see that with Naomi. Now, to go back to that story, right? Naomi, she's lost her husband, she's lost her two sons, she's living in Moab. We're back up in the story a little bit here, and she hears this word that the famine is over, right? Back where she was. The famine is over, and she decides she's going to head back to the promised land. She's going to turn back, and in a very real way, she's going to turn back to God, but she's going to still carry her bitterness with her. And so if you continue to read through chapter 1 in Ruth, what we learn is that she's with her two daughters-in-law, I don't know how you say that. Those two, their names are Orpah and Ruth. Orpah and Ruth are still with Naomi, and so they start walking towards the place, the promised land again. They're going to go back, but Naomi, what does she do in the story? She actually does what most of us tend to do when we're bitter, when we're hurting. She tries to isolate herself, right? Orpah and Ruth are going with her, and she stops, and she fakes the little sweet smile, right? The sweet Naomi, oh, I'm back. And if you read the story, she even blesses them. No, bless you. Just go back to your people. But inside, she's still broken and bitter. Do you do that? I do. She tries to isolate because she believes to the core of her being that if whoever is with her, that her life and the people who are with her are destined to be bitter, are destined for tragedy. That's what her life has been for the last 10 years. No, go back. Your life will be better if you just go back. And so in verse 14, this is what it says. It says, and again, they wept together, Orpah and Ruth and Naomi. They weep together. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. I love how Brendan put this last week, that both of them made a good choice, right? Both Naomi and Ruth made good choices, right? Going back to her people, that's a good choice. Like, life is going to be better for her there. But Ruth made the better choice. And she clung to Naomi. She stuck with her. In this emotional moment, Orpah leaves, but Ruth clings to Naomi. She refuses to give up on her. That leads me to my third question for you. Is who do you turn to when tragedy strikes? Like, who have you tended to turn to, and who do you turn to when tragedy strikes? Like, for me, the way I think about it is like, who are my first phone calls when life starts to hurt? Who do you turn to when tragedy strikes? Because what I've learned is that it is, when tragedy strikes, it's good to be with people who are safe to grieve with. Do you have people like that in your life? For me, this is something I'm really proud of myself, that I've spent the last 20 years trying to build friends like that, trying to invest in friends like that. Friends that we can cry together and be together, friends that will rally around each other when family members die, when there's miscarriages, when marriages are struggling, when divorces happen. Friends that will rally around each other and be with each other. Friends who are safe to even just confess our issues to one another. We're not going to judge one another or condemn one another or shame each other. But friends that'll just be with each other. Call each other forward. Be safe to just grieve with and walk with you through it. Like for me, honestly, it's because of the friends that I have in my life that is in large part why I am the way that I am today. And why I'm able to continue to become the person that God has called me to become. Because I have people in my life who continue to call me forward, who speak out what is true in me, and not just what I'm feeling in the moment or in that season. You know what I love about Ruth? Naomi is so bitter that she changes her name to Mara, right? Which means bitter. What I love about Ruth, never once does she call her by that name. In fact, never once again throughout the rest of Ruth is Naomi called Mara again. Because God refused to let her be defined by her bitterness. God refused to let her be defined by the tragedy that happened to her. And Ruth did too. Do you have people like that in your life? People who are safe to be with, who will walk with you through tragedy, but will never define you by it. That's who Ruth is. I told you, I've been able to be part of this family for a year now, and what I know to be true about this particular community is that each and every one of you are willing to be that for one another, to be someone who is safe to be with. I know that about you. I've experienced that from many of you. But here's the question I want to ask is, I know you are willing to be that for one another, but are you willing to ask that from one another when you're walking through tragedy? That's a hard one, isn't it? I mean, for me, when I'm hurting, I don't want to be a burden, right? I don't want to put that on someone else. And so I keep it to myself. And what I need is people. Are you willing to ask that from the people that are ready and wanting to rally around you? Because I know each of you are willing to be that for each other. But are you willing to ask? Now, as we come to the end of Ruth, before we wrap up this chapter, I want to go back and ask one last thing, because we've learned about Elimelech, we've learned about death and dying, weird. We've learned about Naomi, but the book is called Ruth. Who is Ruth? Who is this woman? We've learned nothing about her yet. Who is Ruth? Well, the very last verse in Ruth gives us a bit of an insight as to who she actually is. In verse 22, it says this. It says, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth. Here it is. The young Moabite woman. Who's Ruth? Well, she's a Moabite. She's someone who was born from incest. That's who Ruth is. Who's Ruth? She's someone who was born into tragedy. She was born in the place that is far from God. She was born in the place that has a different religion, that follows a different God. She was taught from the moment she was born to live counter and contrary to the way that God had designed her. Who is Ruth? She's a widow with no kids to take care of her. Who's Ruth? Ruth is someone that all she has known up to this point in her life is tragedy. That's who Ruth is. That's who this story is all about. Ruth is someone whose life has been defined by tragedy from the moment she was born. But I love this. And Ruth has this moment where they're about to go from Moab into the promised land. And Ruth has this moment where she stops defining herself by her tragedy. She stops believing that tragedy just begets tragedy. And she has this moment where she finally decides, from here on out, the best is yet to come. That there's something better ahead for me. And when she turns and she clings to Naomi and she goes back to the promised land, she has this moment where she decides something better is ahead for me now. And she has this conversation with Naomi that is just beautiful, this incredible thing. And Brendan taught on this all last week. You got to go back. If you missed that, go back, listen to that, watch that. But here's the highlighted passage in verse 16. And this is what Ruth says to Naomi. This moment where she decides, no, life is going to look different from now on. Ruth says, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. Whew. Isn't that powerful? Isn't that incredible? Naomi, no matter what happens from here on out, I'm with you. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. I'm with you. If anything but death separates us, I'm with you. See, what Naomi is actually, or what Ruth is doing here, she's actually giving us a glimpse into what Jesus is like. It's like this little foreshadowing of who Jesus is going to be. If you look back, what Ruth says to Naomi, listen, wherever you go, I go. But Jesus says, I will be with you always. Where Ruth says, wherever you live, I will live, Jesus says, I will send my Spirit to live in you. Where Ruth says, wherever you die, I will die, Jesus says, I'll lay down my life for you. Where Ruth says only death can separate us, Jesus says nothing, not even death, will separate you from his love, from the love of your heavenly Father. You see, what Ruth is doing is giving us a little foreshadow, a little taste of what Jesus will be like, what Jesus is like. What I know to be true about Jesus is that he will never define you by your tragedy, that he has called you to something greater. He has designed you for something greater. Even Jesus isn't defined by his greatest tragedy, right? I mean, the symbol for the Christian faith is the cross, and yet there is no Good Friday, there is no cross without Easter. Right? The defining thing about Jesus isn't the cross. The defining thing about Jesus is his resurrection. It's new life. It's something greater. It's something better. It's that even out of tragedy, God will bring about something new and fresh and good. That the best is always yet to come with Jesus. That's the story of God. That's the story of Jesus. That is what Ruth is giving us a glimpse into, a taste of. And that's the invitation for you and me. That's what this book is all about, that you have a God who loves you and has destined you for something greater, who has destined you for something better, who has designed you from the moment that you were born for something beautiful, for something that reflects the love of your heavenly Father. And that leads me to my fourth and final question. It's, have you given your life to Jesus? Have you given your life to Jesus? Now, when I ask this question, yes, I'm talking about that first initial step into saying, Jesus, I don't know what life has been before this, but I'm yours from here on out. I'm talking about that, but I'm also talking about more than that. Many of us have followed Jesus for years and years. Have you given your life to him? Have you gone all in with Jesus? Is every piece of you moving in the direction, in becoming the person that God has called you to become, has designed you to become? Or have you allowed tragedy to hit the brakes on your walk with God? Have you allowed tragedy to define even the tiniest piece of your life? This morning, I want to give you the invitation to say, God, that's not defining of me anymore, because that's not how you define me. You invite me into something new. See, what I love about a place like Bridgewood is that you come to a place like this and bring your hurts. You bring your wounds. You bring all the crap that you've got going on and that I've got going on. You bring your bitterness. You come to a place like this and know it's safe, that I get it. We're with you. It's okay not to be okay. You come to a place like this and bring all of who you are. It's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to stay that way forever. And this morning, I want to say, don't leave today without taking at least a small step in the direction of Jesus, in the direction of hope, in the direction of new life, in the direction of becoming who God has designed you to be. Have you given your life to Jesus? This morning, as we finish, I just want to pray a simple prayer for us, an invitation that whether this morning maybe is the first time that you're going to say yes to following Jesus, and maybe today, this morning, is the millionth time you're going to say yes to following Jesus. But no matter where you're at, I want to invite us into the same prayer. And it's a declaration of saying, Jesus, I give you my life. It's that simple. There's more conversations you're going to have. There's greater conversations, more specific conversations. But this morning, that's the prayer I want to invite you into. A declarative prayer. Jesus, I give you my life. Make me new. Help me become who you've destined me to become. Bring new life. Would you pray with me? Jesus, this morning we say, I give you my life. Those places that, Lord, I've allowed to be defined by the hurts, the wounds, the tragedies that I've carried with me. Jesus, I give those to you today. I'm trusting you with those today. Would you bring about new life with that? Lord, would you take our stories and would you use them to be testimonies of your goodness, of your faithfulness? Lord, I thank you for the Ruths that have been in my life, who've never defined me by my hurts and my tragedies, but continue to call out the good in me, the Jesus that you've placed in me. Lord, would we be those kinds of people for each other, and would you help us have those people in our lives as well? Lord, we thank you for a community like Bridgewood that rallies around each other, that looks like your love. Lord, thank you for that. Jesus, this morning, we give you our lives. Thank you for being the one who makes things new. Jesus, we love you. Amen.